Brum, brum.
Right, well, we met this bloke called Paul, who's got an absolute room full of films. He's mad about motor racing, and he took a load of films himself. So there's a load of stuff. Anyway, we went to see him, and he's a really good bloke, and we said, well, you know, we'll see what we could do. So anyway, this is one of the films that he gave us. And to be honest, it's old Rivers, who I knew a little bit. But it's quite funny, really, because when we were watching it, I said, oh, this is really funny, because in about 1952, we went to Brands Hatch. I was 12 years old. They went round the other way, and they don't go the way we go now. And there was a 500cc race, and of course, as a kid, I thought, oh, this is marvellous, you know, this is what I ought to be doing, really, at 12 years old. But anyway, that's another story. So anyway, when we go to Brands Hatch, and my dad's standing there and he's going, oh, it's a bit Mickey Mouse, isn't it? And I thought, what's he on about? You know, I mean, how can it be any different to this? So anyway, I'd never been to Brooklands. So anyway, I'm watching old Rivers' film about Brooklands and how he crashed Woolf Barnato's car and everything. It's a bit posh, but, you know, he was a good bloke and he was mad about cars. I remember he had a big accident at Prescott. He rolled this XK 120, there was like a single seater, but anyway, that's another story. But anyway, so it just made me laugh. But anyway, so obviously I go through my life and I get to, my dad was dead, he'd been dead for years, and I had to go to Brooklands to do a bit of sandblasting. At that stage I had a sandblasting business. So anyway, I drove into Brooklands and I couldn't believe it, you know. Well, I just couldn't believe it. It's like going to see the Parthenon for the first time, you know. It was amazing. And then, of course, immediately I realised what my dad was saying, you know, about Brands Hatch being a bit Mickey Mouse. I mean, when you go to Brooklands, I've seen everything in the world's Mickey Mouse. And of course, you couldn't see all of it. But anyway, so that was that. So when I saw the old Rivers film, I thought, well, if I say, you know, how he was at Brooklands and how he was much more upper class than me, but my dad was just a mechanic at Brooklands. But nevertheless, I had a story about Brooklands. So we thought, well, we'll show the film, see how it goes, and if you all love it, we'll try and get some more of them. But anyway, so that's what this film's about. But one of the reasons we're also doing this is we've been so busy. We went to Bewley. Next weekend we're going to Prescott. And my son, Tim, we bought a load of Bentley bits and Tim bought them. And he had some Bentley bits and there were some more bits. And anyway, they're doing this 24-hour race down in Portugal. And about, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, he said, why don't I put all their bits together? Well, to be honest, I think he's mad. But nevertheless, there is a car. So we'll probably make a bit of a film, and I'm going to go down to Mayo with him in my van, and we're going to hopefully put the Bentley in the van so we don't have to tow a trailer. And as I've got a licence, they put my name down. I mean, I don't know if I should do much driving because I don't fancy it, to be honest, but nevertheless, if as it appears, I'll get in the car and drive it round. So that's the thing. And so what we're going to do, we're going to make a bit of a video about it. But, you know, to be honest, this is my son's thing, and I don't really want to, you know, rain on his parade, if you know what I mean. But so we don't really know what's going to happen. But nevertheless, if we do make a video, you will see it. And I think it's going to be a bit of a laugh, you know, all them Bentley people trying to do 24 hours around that circuit. I've actually been there in my TVR, and it's a bit up and down, but they've all done it. Some of them have done it before, and it was a great success. So we'll see. So there you are. Don't forget a bit of feedback, and I'll be getting the old Hall and Scott going with a new breather that one of our followers has suggested, and it's really clever. Roger, but unless I actually try it out, I can't say. But in my mind, It's brilliant. It's simple and it's brilliant. But we won't talk about it because we'll make a film about it and you'll see it. But anyway, here we go. Rivers Fletcher reflecting on how he raced round Brooklands as a passenger because he was only a little boy and they could only get a little boy in the car with Malcolm Campbell, and then how he got a job with Bentley. And, you know, we'll see what you think.
Brooklands, this wonderful place, it's full of ghosts for me because it all started for me here many years ago in the 1920s when I was a schoolboy. I had been mad keen on cars for years and years, and then fortunately my parents knew Malcolm Campbell, who was one of the great racing drivers of that period. As a matter of fact, my parents didn't like him very much, thought he was a bit wild. And my parents were not interested in motor racing. The family cars were very ordinary cars. My father was a stockbroker. We lived in Hertfordshire. But for me, it had to be cars, fast cars, motor racing, since I was about 10. Anyway, in 1928, my last year at school, I read in the autocar. I said read in the autocar. That's about the only thing I read. Motor books at that time. Anyway, I read in the autocar that Malcolm Campbell would be driving his Bugatti in the JCC Junior Grand Prix at Brooklands, and it was going to take place during the Easter holidays. I thought, jolly good, home for the Easter holidays. I'll be able to see Malcolm Campbell drive the Bugatti, because I had actually sat in that car. But what I didn't know was that Malcolm Campbell had just bought another car, the fastest Grand Prix car in the world of those days, a straight-eight 1.5-litre Delage, a French racing car which had dominated Grand Prix the previous year, and Malcolm Campbell bought the best of these. And when it arrived in England, he thought he'd run it in this race, this JCC Grand Prix at Brooklands, and saw the regulations required him to carry a riding mechanic, and damn it, the car was a single-seater, not eligible. All the other cars, Bugattis, Fraser-Nashes, and other cars like that, were two-seaters, which was the normal in those days, and it was fairly normal in those days to require the driver to carry a riding mechanic. But of course this Delage was a single-seater. It wasn't what we call monoposto. You didn't sit in the middle with the prop shaft between your legs. The prop shaft was on the driver's left side, and there was a little room for an oil tank, but not room enough for a mechanic. As a matter of fact, I remember Campbell said that he did try to see if he could squash Leo Villa, his mechanic, in, but he couldn't get in. There wasn't enough leg room, and anyway he'd been sitting too high, and he was just about deciding that he'd have to run the Bugatti instead of the Delage. And then Joan Taylor, his private secretary, who's a jolly good friend of all of our family, had this wonderful idea, said to Campbell, what about young Rivers? He's 16, but he's still at school. He's quite small, particularly small in the bottom. You could squash him into the Delage and run in the Grand Prix, and Rivers he'd count as your mechanic. Campbell thought this was a fabulous idea, so he and Leo Villa had a look at the Delage, and they reckoned that they could squash a small boy in quite well. So the next morning, Malcolm Campbell telephoned my father on the stock exchange and said, can I have young Rivers as my mechanic in the Grand Prix at Brooklands when he comes home for the Easter holiday? Well, of course, my father was furious. I told you, my father didn't like Campbell, thought he was a bit wild anyway, and thought this was a ridiculous idea and said it was out of the question. That night he told my mother, who agreed, absolutely absurd. And then I'm jolly lucky because they had second thoughts about that. I understand my mother said, you know, one day Rivers will be told about this and he'll never forgive us. And then, you know, Malcolm is racing every weekend and he's still alive and he hasn't had a bad accident. Is it really all that dangerous? Anyway, they decided that they ought to give me this chance. So I understand that my father telephoned Malcolm Campbell and said, if you promise to drive very carefully in a Grand Prix. Well, of course, Campbell typically said, I'm always very careful, never take any risks. Of course, no problems, no difficulty, no danger. That's how it all started for me. I came home for the Easter holidays and was told, yes, we're going to Brooklands, but you won't be in the grandstand, you're riding with Malcolm Campbell in the Delard. Well, really, I didn't believe it because it was such a wonderful opportunity. I couldn't believe this good luck. But when I arrived at Brooklands, they'd put a little cushion on top of the oil tank. Leo Villa had screwed a little handle on the scuttle and a strap round behind Malcolm Campbell's shoulder. They gave me a pair of goggles, and Campbell said, Rivers, you're my racing mechanic. All you have to do is to hold on. Of course, there were real mechanics like Leo Villa looking after the car in the pits and so on. Anyway, he said it's a very short race. You won't have to come into the pits, and all you have to do is to hold on. Well, of course, I'd been round Brooklands in a 3-litre Bentley, just a touring car, but the start of a Grand Prix is really quite a thing. Anyway, I remember as they were going up to the start line, I said, sir, is there anything else that I can do other than hold on? And Campbell said, well, you keep check of the number of laps, because I may want to know how many laps we've done. And if anyone wants to pass me, thump me on the back. And then he said, well, I've got the fastest car. I don't intend to be overtaken, but anyway. So I thought, well, I've got a job to do, and it was tremendously exciting. I remember going just before the start line, we were all lined up there before the cars were started. Campbell called out to another man standing by the car and said, Francis, come over and meet my young mechanic. And that's how I met Viscount Curzon, who later became Earl Howe, who later was the president of the British Racing Drivers Club and the ERA Club, and one of our leading racing drivers. And I met him on that first occasion when he was just starting his motor racing career, and I was starting as well, of course at a very different level. I mean, he was 40 and I was 16. Anyway, I remember I said to Campbell that I'll watch out for anyone overtaking, and it was a handicap race with the smallest cars, Austin 7s first of all, and then the 1100cc cars, Amel cars and Samsons and so on, and a Vernon Derby, and then we were the scratch cars, the supercharged cars. Well, you know, all those years ago, the cars were very harshly sprung, very tiny little tires, looking like motorcycle tires now, and of course no soft suspension with independent suspension or anything like that, and Brooklands was very, very bumpy. And of course for the first few laps I could scarcely breathe. I mean, Campbell had a cowl and a windscreen in front of him, but I was up to my navel in the airstream and being thrown about like mad. Of course the car was jerking all the time. There was a terrific noise and wonderful smell of Castrol. Anyway, I could scarcely breathe for several laps, and then I began to get used to it and be able to notice what was happening, and obviously we were doing very well. But coming off the banking every lap, we hit a big bump and I was thrown high up in the air, goggles blown round my neck, and I had to wait until we reached the fork. That was a hairpin, a second gear hairpin. Then I dared take my hand off and adjust the goggles. And this happening every lap, and Campbell saw all this drama going on and shouted to me, "What's the matter?" And I told him that I thought my goggles were a bit loose. And then the next lap, flying round the top of the banking, flat out, right at the top of the banking, I remember, I felt a scratching over my ear. Campbell was steering with the right hand, tightening my goggles with the left. All I had to do was to hold on. Anyway, I assured him that I could cope. Anyway, we were doing very well. We were mopping up the opposition. I remember one of the Fraser-Nashes, I think it was Glennie's Fraser-Nash, got sideways at the fork, and Campbell, cool as a cucumber, adjusted his line round the corner without any difficulty at all. And we were obviously going to win the race at the rate we were going. The only problems was that we were getting supercharger blowback and smoke coming into the cockpit. But I was first of all worried about this, but Campbell didn't take any notice at all, so obviously it didn't matter. My mother and my young brother, watching from the paddock stand, saw that the cars were doing very well, but Malcolm Campbell had sheets of orange flame coming out of the exhaust pipe on the overrun before the chicanes and for the top corner, and it looked as though the car was going to catch fire. Actually, there was no danger, but it just looked very exciting, and my mother was jolly frightened about the whole thing. I didn't see that, of course. I was told about this afterwards. Anyway, what happened? Well, now, then suddenly I thought, my God, I have no idea how many laps. I'd have felt such a twit, but fortunately he never asked me. You know, with this one job to do, because I didn't have to thump his back on it. I mean, George Easton and Chris Stanleyland got a bit close during the first few laps, but obviously they were not trying to overtake. I didn't thump Campbell's shoulder, and of course he might have wanted to know how many laps we'd done, but I hadn't a clue. We ran through the race and got the checkered flag, a wonderful victory, and really nothing for me to do at all. I remember I climbed out of the cockpit at the end and was told to get back and sit there for photographs. I look back on those photographs, I see that I put my goggles on upside down, but that was only for the photographs afterwards. Anyway, and then I was strutting round the paddock, this paddock here, signing autographs, you know, age 16. Shocking, but a wonderful start, wonderful start. Of course, up to that time, the plot in my family was that I should leave school and go into the church. Various other members of my family went into the church, but of course, for me, it had to be cars.
I'm awfully glad that you didn't go into the church.
Oh, yes. I mean, it had to be fast cars. And I was jolly lucky second time, really, because living in Hertfordshire, the nearest motor manufacturer was Bentley Motors Limited. I know Bentleys are now made at Crewe. Before that, they were made in Derby. But in the 1920s, they were made at Cricklewood in London, only about 9 miles away from our home. And my father knew Captain Woolf Barnato, the chairman of Bentleys. My father didn't like him either, really, not for the same reason as Malcolm Campbell, because he thought he was, you know, leading too exciting a life with all these. He was Woolf Barnato was a fabulous character, really, a multi-millionaire, madly good-looking, an incredibly good sportsman. I mean, he was not only a top racing driver, he had won at Le Mans, but he hunted with the Quorn, he was a scratch man at golf, he played very good tennis, he was a heavyweight boxer, and played cricket for Surrey. Second 11, of course, but still a county cricketer of sorts. Anyway, all in one man, and he was quite young. I thought he was absolutely wonderful. But my parents, my father particularly, didn't like him, and Of course, he was always in the glossy magazines with the wrong bird, and I thought, what a life, you know. And my father thought, that's no life for my eldest son, Rivers. So, but anyway, because he was the chairman and Bentley was the obviously choice for me, I was taken to meet Woolf Barnato and joined Bentley Motors Limited and served my engineering apprenticeship in that fabulous company at Cricklewood. And then I had a wonderful time there, rather spoiled, I suppose, because of Campbell and Barnato. And then when I'd completed my apprenticeship, I became junior salesman of the company, very junior. Really, I wasn't old enough to be a junior salesman at all, but that was the way the company was run by Woolf Barnato, I think. Great fun, wonderful life. Not really commercial. I don't think Bentley Motors Limited ever made any profit or anything, but it was a wonderful life. I could go on telling stories about Bentleys and Barnatos, but one thing does stick in my memory because it really shows what a very different world it was in the 1920s and early 1930s. Well, when I was this junior salesman, Captain Woolf Barnato, Babe to his friends, Sir to me, had a lovely country house in Surrey and a town flat in Grosvenor Square. And when he was in London, living in London at Grosvenor Square, he'd always had some of his own Bentleys with him, and there wasn't enough room in the garage behind the flat in the mews at Grosvenor Square to keep those cars. So we, in the showrooms, we had to have his cars amongst our demonstration fleet. And when he wanted one of his cars, being the junior, I usually had the nice job of taking it round to Grosvenor Square. And I remember one wet morning, I was standing up in the showrooms waiting for customers, and my boss, the sales manager, came through and shouted out, "Rivers, the captain wants his unsupercharged 4.5. Take it round to Grosvenor Square." I thought, jolly good, because of course I loved driving his cars. They were the best, you know. And it was a wet morning. And those of you who know London, who know that to get from our showrooms just off Bond Street to Grosvenor Square, you have to go down Bruton Street, down Bruton Street, right round Berkeley Square. That's a noisy motorbike being revved up, isn't it? Anyway, it's good music, the right sort of music for Brooklands. Anyway, I remember that I drove down Bruton Street, and I was doing several extra laps of Berkeley Square before going into Grosvenor Square. Well, you would, wouldn't you? Having a go, you know, feeling like Le Mans. And I lost it in the biggest possible way. The tail swung right out, hit a taxi. Of course, the taxi fell apart. The Bentley had its radiator put back over the block, water gushing everywhere. So I climbed out of the wreck and thought, my God, I've done it in one, you know, my job, my career, this super boss. Super boss, and I'd smashed his car. I coped with the police and the taxi driver. No one was hurt or anything. Rushed back to the showrooms on foot and told my boss, and he looked aghast. He said, "Rivers, that 4.5 happens to be the captain's favourite Bentley at the moment." He said, "I daren't tell him, you know, how tough he is, because he was a very tough chap." He said, "You'll have to take the demonstration car and take it off to Grosvenor Square and tell him what happens." Terrible job. Anyway, I remember I arrived at Grosvenor Square feeling like death, and eventually the butler said, "The captain will see you," and I was ushered up to his bedroom. Great big room, and there was the captain sitting up in bed having his breakfast with the most beautiful blonde you've ever seen. Absolutely marvellous. I recognised her immediately. Oh, I didn't know her. Good heavens, no. I mean, I wasn't in that league at all. But, of course, I'd seen the show. I should explain that in those days, you know, the international sportsmen, their girlfriends weren't models. They hadn't invented models in the 1920s and 30s. Their girlfriends were the stars of stage and screen, and I'd seen the musical comedy in which she was one of the stars. Well, of course, that wasn't my problem. And you know how it is. If you've made an ass of yourself, you know, you've got to say something. And I remember I went to the foot of the bed and I said how wet it was and how I thought some fool had dropped oil in Berkeley Square. And then every time I looked up, and there was the captain scowling at me at the top of his egg. And then I had to complete the story and tell him how I shunted his car. That lovely blonde, she just put her hands on the captain's shoulder, and the captain turns and smiled. Well, he had to smile because she looked so gorgeous sitting up there. And he still had that lovely grin on his face when I finished the story. And he turned to me and he said, "Rivers, you'll never do it again. Now run along, run along." And that was the end of the story. Marvellous for me because I never heard anything more about it again.
Mate, don't forget to subscribe and don't forget to put the like button. See you all soon.